The cold, the kind of absolute, macabre cold that seems to soak into the very bones of the Appalachian Mountains, was a constant, disturbing presence. It was November 1883, and the unforgiving landscape of western North Carolina had already begun its cruel annual ritual of hibernation. The small, isolated cabin of Elias and Martha Thorne sat nestled deep within a hollow, a place so remote that even the echo of civilization seemed vanished entirely. But on this specific night, the chill in the air was compounded by a different, more horrifying sensation: the deep, penetrating sound of a sustained, agonizing scream, muffled and trapped, rising from the earth itself. It was a sound that should have shattered the pristine silence of the wilderness, yet it remained contained, a forbidden noise known only to the two people who called that lonely cabin home. Martha, pregnant, terrified and weakened by months of imprisonment, was trying to scream her way through the thick, dirt-packed ceiling of the cellar that had become her grave. Elias, her husband, stood above her, a silhouette in the dim kerosene light, his face a study in detached, terrifying calmness. The sound was just a bother to him, a nuisance to be dealt with. He took a heavy, knotted shawl and pushed it through the small, bolted trapdoor that was the cellar's only access point. "Quiet, woman." His voice was a low, chilling rumble, devoid of mercy or humanity. "You'll wake the mountain, and I wouldn't want the mountain to know the curse I'm carrying down here." The silence that followed was not one of submission, but of sheer, exhausted desperation. Martha knew the rules, she knew the lock, and she knew that the life growing inside her was the very thing that had sealed her disturbing fate in this earthen tomb. The long night had just begun, a night that would either end in the most macabre of discoveries or a stunning, desperate escape that history would struggle to believe. The year 1883 was, for most of America, an age of burgeoning industry and westward expansion. But in the shadow-draped valleys of Appalachia, time moved differently. Life was hard, brutal, and frequently short. Folklore and superstition were not quaint stories. They were as real and present as the ever-looming threat of starvation or sickness. It is into this dark and isolated world that we must venture to understand the horrifying genesis of the Thorne tragedy. Elias Thorne was not a man of the mountains by birth, but by choice, a disturbing detail that local lore would later twist into something far more macabre. He arrived suddenly, seemingly from nowhere, a decade prior, buying up a dilapidated homestead with a strange urgency. He was reserved, almost silent, with eyes that perpetually seemed to be looking at something not quite in the present. The local men found him unsettling, but his competency with an axe and a plow eventually earned him a grudging, distant respect. Then came Martha, a woman whose origins are equally vanished from the historical record. She was described, in the scant journals that mention her, as frail but possessing a defiant inner light, a light that Elias seemed intent on snuffing out. They married quickly, a wedding that lacked the usual Appalachian celebration, replaced instead by a palpable, creepy silence. The foundation of their life, both literally and figuratively, was built on that isolated patch of earth, and it was a foundation that Elias had meticulously reinforced. The cellar beneath their small cabin was not a simple root storage space. It was a purpose-built structure, reinforced with heavy timber and rock, possessing a single, thick wooden door, hinged and bolted on the outside. A construction detail that, in retrospect, served a single chilling purpose: imprisonment. We must delve deeper into the nature of this marriage, and what forbidden secret Elias Thorne was so desperate to keep buried under his floorboards. The psychological landscape of Elias Thorne remains a cold case wrapped in the macabre shroud of Appalachian isolation. What truly drove a man, seemingly unremarkable, to construct a literal cage for the woman carrying his child? Was it madness, paranoia, or something darker, rooted in the peculiar, disturbing superstitions that clung to the region like the pervasive morning fog? Historical accounts, fragmented and often colored by the sensationalism of the era, point toward a descent that began not with violence, but with obsession. Martha's pregnancy, initially a source of quiet joy for her, became, for Elias, a terrifying curse. The folklore of the mountains spoke in hushed tones of changelings and hollow-born infants, bobbies supposedly tainted or swapped by malevolent forest spirits. Elias, despite his veneer of practicality, was a man deeply susceptible to the ambient dread of his surroundings. His obsession centered on the belief that his wife, or perhaps the child, was marked. He began to withdraw, his already silent demeanor becoming a terrifying vacuum of emotion. He stopped touching Martha, stopped speaking to her about anything but chores, and spent hours in the woods, returning with strange, forbidden herbs and bundles of twisted, dark roots. His behavior wasn't simply abusive, it was ritualistic, a slow-burn preparation for the act he would soon commit. Martha tried to confide in the nearest neighbor, a farmer named Jedediah, but the journey was long, and Elias always seemed to know. One day, her voice vanished entirely from the community, cut off by the impenetrable distance. The final, horrifying step came during the 7th month of her pregnancy. It wasn't a sudden outburst. It was a calm, premeditated act, sealing her fate and opening a new chapter in the dark history of that hollow. The details surrounding Martha's imprisonment are both clinical and disturbing. Elias didn't drag her down in a fit of rage. He informed her with a chilling lack of emotion that she would be safer down there. "The spirits won't bother you if you're under the earth," he supposedly told her, his eyes holding a fanatical gleam. The cellar, though dry and structurally sound, was utterly devoid of comfort. No straw bedding, only cold, packed dirt. No windows, save for the narrow, grated vent near the foundation, which was just large enough to let in a sliver of light and the macabre sounds of the night. Her diet, meager and calculated, was designed to keep her alive but weak. Hardtack, thin broth, and water delivered once a day through the trapdoor, like an offering to a subterranean beast. This act of sustained cruelty wasn't merely abuse. It was a deliberate, drawn-out execution of her spirit, a terrifying cold case of domestic terrorism. For over 3 weeks, the creepy routine continued. Elias would work the land above her, the rhythmic thump of his boots and the scrape of his shovel a constant, horrifying reminder of his control. Martha, trapped in the darkness, was forced to confront the absolute dark reality of her situation. She was alone, 7 months pregnant, and entirely at the mercy of a man who believed she carried a curse. Her mind, in the silence and the cold, began to turn inward, desperately searching for a way out. She realized quickly that escape was not a matter of force, but of patience, observation, and exploiting the one fatal flaw in her husband's meticulous forbidden design. It was a slow-burn battle of wits fought between the cold earth and the chilling determination of a man gone mad. The small, grated vent. That was the flaw. Not the door, which was secured by 3 heavy iron bolts, but the single airway necessary to prevent the cellar from becoming a tomb too quickly. Elias, in his macabre preoccupation with earth spirits, had overlooked the practical realities of long-term containment. The vent, usually covered by a hinged wooden shutter on the outside to keep out animals and the worst of the cold, was his single moment of vulnerability. Martha, in the absolute darkness of her imprisonment, used the slivers of light and sound that penetrated the space to mark the passage of time and, more importantly, to observe her captor's routine. Her mind, sharp despite the malnutrition, began to piece together a map of Elias' predictable, methodical life. He was a creature of habit. He only opened the trapdoor at dusk to pass down the rations. He only checked the exterior vent once a week. The rest of the time, she heard his movements above, a monotonous, horrifying metronome counting down to her confinement's end, one way or another. But to exploit the vent, she needed a tool, and a forbidden object capable of manipulating the small, rusty nails that secured its inner grating. The cellar was bare, empty, except for the inevitable accumulation of small rocks and loose debris that naturally fell from the overhead beams and the seams of the packed dirt floor. And in the corner, almost vanished beneath a layer of dust, was a single, bent and rusted piece of metal, a relic from the previous owner's broken shovel. It was perhaps 4 inches long, sharp on one end, and utterly vital to her survival. This small, creepy shard of metal became her sole focus, her secret weapon in a game of escalating dread. The psychological toll of the imprisonment was a dark shadow more pervasive than the lack of light. Martha wrestled with the fear that Elias might simply forget her, or worse, that the sheer isolation would break her mind before her body gave out. The baby's movements, once a comfort, now became a source of disturbing anxiety, a constant physical reminder of the ticking clock. She knew she had to act before the birth. That was the deadline, a macabre certainty. The rusted metal shard, her key, was clumsy and difficult to use, but under the cover of the absolute darkness, Martha began her slow, forbidden work. The interior grating of the vent was held by 4 iron nails, driven deep into the timber framing. Every day, in the hours between Elias' movements, she would work one nail, using the sharp end to scrape away the surrounding wood, then the bent end to gently, painstakingly pry the head. The sound was her greatest enemy. A faint, almost imperceptible scrape, yet in the total silence of the cellar it sounded like a hammer blow. She had to listen for the slightest change in the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, or the heavy rain, any ambient noise to mask her desperate endeavor. This was her cold case in miniature, an attempt to uncover the evidence of her freedom, nail by nail. The physical pain was immense, her fingers blistered and bleeding, her back a constant throb of protest. But the knowledge that her only other fate was to deliver her child into a subterranean grave fueled her. She was engaged in a creepy and silent act of rebellion against the man who had become her tormentor, a man driven by a lunatic fear of a curse. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the slow, agonizing progress on the vent. 2 nails were out. 2 remained, the rust clinging to them like a dark adhesive. Martha's body was failing. The lack of nourishment had turned her once defiant spirit into a thin, brittle shell. Elias, meanwhile, seemed to grow calmer, more serene in the knowledge of her imprisonment. He had tamed the curse, or so he believed. He spent his days in the woods, felling timber, his life returning to a state of creepy normalcy, the cries from the cellar now infrequent whispers. But the mountain has its own memory, and the forbidden act committed under its roof was beginning to attract an unwanted, if highly localized, attention. Jedediah, the neighboring farmer, had stopped by once, a fortnight ago, ostensibly to borrow a tool. He hadn't seen Martha in months. Elias had blocked the door, talking loudly, too quickly, about a trip she had taken to see a distant relative. Jedediah, a man of simple faith and deep, innate suspicion, had noticed the new, heavy-duty padlock on the outside of the cellar door, a detail that was both unusual and disturbing. Why lock up a root cellar so meticulously in a place where only bears and field mice were the threat? He left with a sense of unease that lingered like smoke. This small seed of doubt, planted in the mind of an honest man, was the first external crack in Elias Thorne's carefully constructed macabre reality. It was a foreshadowing, a subtle turn in the slow-burn suspense of Martha's escape attempt. The outside world was beginning to stir, but Martha had no way of knowing. She was still in the absolute dark, fighting the final, resistant nails. On a Tuesday, marked by a sudden, violent downpour that turned the hillside into a slick, muddy nightmare, Martha succeeded. The final nail gave way with a tiny, protesting groan of rusted metal. The grating, heavy and cold, was free. She pushed it aside, her breath catching in her throat, a wave of cold, fresh air rushing into the stagnant confines of the cellar. It was the most beautiful, horrifying sensation she had ever felt. The escape was now physically possible, but strategically it was more dangerous than ever. The vent opening was narrow, barely wide enough for her body, even in her weakened state. And critically, the outside shutter was closed, latched, and secured with a small metal hook, a minor barrier, but one that required delicate manipulation from the inside. She had to wait for the cover of night, wait for Elias to be soundly asleep, and then begin the most precarious journey of her life. She spent the day conserving every ounce of her remaining strength, her heart thumping a macabre rhythm against her ribs. She needed a tool for the outer hook, and she found it in the cellar's ceiling, a long, thin sliver of wood she managed to pry free from a loose floorboard. This small, almost insignificant object became the second forbidden key to her freedom. The day dragged on, the rain drumming a dark suspense on the cabin roof. Elias was home. She could hear him moving, cooking, humming a creepy, off-key tune. The waiting was an agony, a final psychological gauntlet. Her imprisonment had lasted 26 days. The night of freedom was about to begin, and she knew with terrifying certainty that failure meant not just death, but a cold case that would vanish forever into the Appalachian mist. As darkness fell, a profound, almost primal silence descended upon the Thorn cabin. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the trees like a macabre shroud. Inside the cabin, Elias' movement ceased. The rhythmic, deep snoring of a man utterly at peace with his disturbing actions began to drift down through the floorboards, the sound of her captor's perfect slumber. This was her moment. Martha, moving with the slow, agonizing precision of a ghost, crawled to the vent opening. The packed dirt was cold against her skin, a physical reminder of the earth she was trying to escape. Her first task was the exterior shutter. She pushed the long, thin sliver of wood through the gap, aiming for the metal hook. It was a creepy, delicate operation, working entirely by feel, her fingers trembling with a mixture of cold, fear, and sheer adrenaline. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Click. The sound was barely audible, yet in the tense silence it felt like a gunshot. The hook had released. Now the harder part, the physical escape. She had to push the heavy shutter open and then contort her pregnant body through the narrow opening. She pushed with her shoulder, the thick wood scraping against the stone foundation. It gave way an inch, then two. A rush of cold, damp air flooded her face, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, the perfume of liberty. This was a true forbidden moment, one that, if caught, would lead to horrifying reprisal. She closed her eyes, whispered a desperate, broken prayer, and began to pull herself through, one painful, inch-by-inch struggle against the stone and the timber. The escape from the cellar was a study in agonizing slowness, a deliberate stretching of suspense. Martha was halfway out, her hips wedged painfully against the foundation stones, when a sudden, disturbing shift in the floorboards above her brought her movements to a complete frozen stop. Elias had moved. Had he woken up? Had he heard the faint scraping of the shutter? She lay there, halfway in and halfway out of her earthen prison, utterly helpless. The world was reduced to the muffled creak of wood above and the pounding, macabre rhythm of her own heart. The movement stopped. A deep guttural sigh filtered through the floorboards. Elias was just turning over in his sleep. The relief that washed over Martha was physical, almost dizzying, but it gave her the final surge of adrenaline she needed. With a desperate heave, she pulled the rest of her body through the opening, scraping skin and tearing her thin shift, landing on the cold, wet earth outside. She was free. But this was only the first, perilous step. She was weak, disoriented, and standing right next to the cabin of her tormentor. The smell of wood smoke and pine was sharp in her nostrils. The full moon was vanished behind the thick fog, casting the woods into a pervasive, dark gloom. She had to get away, and quickly. She knew Elias kept a shotgun leaning by the fireplace. The thought of him waking up, seeing the open vent, and grabbing that weapon was a fresh wave of horrifying dread. She forced herself up, ignoring the spasms of pain, and began to crawl, not run, into the enveloping, creepy darkness of the forest, putting distance between herself and the forbidden curse of that lonely cabin. Martha's progress was pitifully slow. Every few yards she had to stop, clutching her swollen belly, gasping for breath. The rough, uneven ground, littered with roots, rocks, and wet leaves, was an active enemy. She needed to reach Jedediah's farm, the only pocket of humanity she knew, situated almost 3 miles away, a Herculean journey for a healthy person, let alone one in her condition. The forest at night was a symphony of unsettling sounds, the rustle of unknown creatures, the distant, creepy call of a night bird, the wind sighing through the pines like the whisper of 1,000 vanished souls. Each sound was amplified, becoming a potential signal to Elias. She kept looking back, half expecting to see the sudden flash of a kerosene lantern, followed by the horrifying crack of the shotgun. But the cabin remained silent, a dark shadow in the mist. As she pushed deeper, the historical curse of the region began to manifest in her mind. This section of Appalachia was known for its haunts and ghost lights, tales of lost travelers and macabre deeds committed generations ago. The fear of her husband was being compounded by the ancient, primal fear of the dark. She began to use the mountain streams, walking directly in the cold water to mask her scent and footprints, a detail Elias, an experienced hunter, would immediately check for. This small, calculated strategy was a testament to the fact that her mind, though terrified, was still razor-sharp. She was fighting on two fronts, the physical battle against the wilderness and the psychological war against the escalating dread that her time might be running out. Back at the cabin, the sun was beginning to peek through the fog, casting a weak, cold light onto the scene. Elias Thorne woke up. He noticed the silence first, the complete unexpected absence of the shuffling, the breathing, the occasional, almost imperceptible moan that had become the macabre backdrop to his life. He sat up, an immediate chilling tension gripping him. His eyes went instantly to the trapdoor. It was bolted, secure. He felt a brief, smug satisfaction. But then a flicker of doubt, a creepy intuition, made him swing his legs out of bed. He crossed the room, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and knelt by the trapdoor. He called down, his voice low and demanding. No answer, only the cold, empty silence. His calm shattered. He flung back the bolts, yanked the door open, and stared down into the absolute darkness of the cellar. It was empty. The sudden, horrifying revelation hit him like a physical blow. She was gone. His carefully constructed imprisonment had failed. His curse was loose. His eyes darted around the cellar floor, and he saw the displaced grating, the muddy track leading to the foundation vent. The realization of how she had escaped, the quiet, methodical, forbidden work done right under his sleeping feet, fueled his rage into something truly disturbing and primal. The hunt had begun. Elias grabbed his heavy hunting coat, his boots, and the double-barreled shotgun. He was no longer a man driven by superstition. He was a predator driven by the need to silence his failure and reclaim his possession. The clock was now ticking for Martha, but the mountain was about to witness a dark pursuit that would embed itself into the local cold case folklore. Elias was a hunter born and bred to the dark heart of the woods, and Martha's escape, though desperate, had left faint, crucial signs. The wet ground outside the vent was a mess of scuff marks and small, deep depressions where her hands and knees had pressed. Elias found the trail quickly, his eyes scanning the forest floor with a terrifying, almost inhuman focus. His immediate, disturbing thought was not to involve the distant, ineffective county sheriff. It was to handle this himself, to correct his error and reimpose his forbidden order. The chase was not a search party. It was a deadly, personal correction. He was armed, well-fed, and driven by a lunatic's belief in a curse. Martha was none of those things. Elias followed the initial, stumbling trail for 100 yards before it vanished abruptly near the small creek. He stopped, recognizing the maneuver instantly. She was trying to mask her scent in the water. A flicker of cold respect, quickly overshadowed by his macabre fury, crossed his face. He didn't waste time following the stream. Instead, he employed the mountain man's logic. Where would a weakened, pregnant woman head? The answer was always the nearest sign of life, the direction of Jedediah's farm. Cutting diagonally through the woods, away from the stream, Elias began to run, his pace deceptively fast, his long legs eating up the difficult terrain. He was hunting her, not with a dog, but with a knowledge of the land as intimate and creepy as the shadows themselves. This cold case was on the verge of becoming an open, horrifying tragedy, one that would cement the dark history of the Hollow forever. Martha, struggling through the dense underbrush, was starting to feel the first, agonizing pangs of premature labor. The physical exertion, the fear, the cold, it was all culminating in the horrifying reality that she might deliver her child right there, alone in the dark woods with a madman hunting her. She stopped near a massive, moss-covered boulder, resting her back against the rough, cold stone, desperately trying to control her breathing. It was here, in this moment of absolute despair, that she saw the sign. A broken twig, snapped not by an animal but by the heavy, deliberate heel of a man's boot. He was not far behind. He was off the stream, cutting her off. Elias knew her destination. A wave of renewed terror, cold and macabre, washed over her. She could not reach Jedediah's farm in time, not with the increasing contractions. She needed a hiding place, a place so forbidden or so remote that even Elias in his fanatical state would overlook it. Her eyes scanned the familiar yet creepy landscape. And then she remembered the legends, the half-whispered tales of the old miner's hole, an abandoned, unstable shaft nestled high on the ridge, a place locals believed was cursed and avoided for decades. It was a risk. A collapse would be a permanent imprisonment, but it was her only chance. Changing direction, she began a brutal, vertical climb up the steep incline, leaving the relative safety of the valley floor for the treacherous, disturbing heights. The hunter was closing in, but the prey had chosen a darker, more desperate sanctuary. Elias found the broken twig moments later, confirming his cold, calculated guess. He was on the right path. He knew the direction she was headed, and the sheer pace of his pursuit should have guaranteed a capture within the hour. But then he saw the subtle shift in her track, the sudden, almost vertical ascent up the rocky slope leading toward the ridge. He stopped, his brow furrowing in a moment of disturbing confusion. Why would she climb? Why would she abandon the easier route to the settlement? Then the name flashed through his mind, the old miner's hole, a place even Elias, with his macabre disregard for local custom, avoided. It was steeped in creepy folklore, stories of miners vanished without a trace, and the lingering sense of a curse. Elias hesitated, a rare moment of his lunatic certainty wavering. The thought of entering that forbidden place, even to reclaim his wife, filled him with an unexpected, visceral dread. This small delay was Martha's saving grace, a crucial 10-minute window of respite, but the pause was brief. His fanatical obsession soon overcame his superstition. "She's trying to hide her mistake under the earth again," he muttered, his voice a low, dark growl. "But my earth is the only one that can hold her." He raised the shotgun, checked the charge, and began his ascent, his movements slower now, more cautious, recognizing the inherent danger of the old mine shaft. The final confrontation was not going to be on the open trail, but in a confined, horrifying space, a confrontation that the mountain would soon swallow whole. The entrance to the old miner's hole was not a dramatic cavern, but a narrow, squat opening, partially concealed by decades of growth and framed by two ancient, twisted pines. Martha slipped inside, the air immediately turning cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet stone and decay. The absolute darkness was total, a profound, suffocating void, but this time it was a darkness of her own choosing. She crawled forward a few feet, then stopped, hugging the cold wall. The sound of her own ragged breathing echoed eerily in the shaft. She had escaped a cellar only to enter a tomb. The tunnel was narrow, forcing her to move on her hands and knees, the roof low. She could hear the faint sound of Elias' heavy boots crunching on the rocks outside the entrance. He was there. He was close. The creepy sound of his breathing, followed by the metallic click of the shotgun being cocked, filtered into the tunnel. She held her breath, willing the intense, agonizing contraction that was just beginning to pass. She needed absolute silence. Outside, Elias called her name, his voice no longer cold or controlled but strained, laced with a terrifying desperation. "Martha, come out. Don't drag the curse into this forbidden place. It'll take us both." His words were a blend of threat and delusion, the voice of a man losing his final grip on reality. Martha did not move. She remained frozen, a small, dark shape in the deep shadows, the pain of her labor now a searing, distracting agony. The hunter was at the mouth of the dark cave, but the darkness was suddenly fighting back, not just for Martha, but for the macabre secrets of the mountain itself. The stillness within the mine shaft stretched into a terrifying, sustained moment of suspense. Elias, shotgun in hand, did not immediately follow her in. The old miner's superstition was still a powerful inhibitor, a mental barrier against his rage. He knew the shaft was unstable, riddled with false passages and deadly, vertical drops. He was a hunter, not a suicide. He yelled again, a final, guttural demand for her surrender. When the only response was the creepy echo of his own voice, Elias made a tactical error driven by his macabre fury. He fired a single shot into the air, a warning blast designed to terrify her into retreat. The sound in the confined space was deafening, a physical shockwave that hammered against Martha's already strained body. More importantly, the concussion was too much for the old, rotten timber supports lining the mine entrance. With a groan that sounded like 1,000 vanished souls crying out, the entrance shuddered, and a cascade of rocks, dirt, and splintered wood rained down, partially obscuring the opening. Elias was thrown back, momentarily stunned and covered in debris but physically unharmed. Martha, deep inside, felt the tremor, the air thick with dust and the sudden, disturbing realization of the collapse. The forbidden entrance was now partially sealed. She was trapped, but so was Elias' direct route to her. The confrontation was now guaranteed, but the terrain had just shifted in a way that was both horrifying and providential. Elias scrambled to clear the debris, his hands bleeding, his mind a volatile mix of panic and renewed rage. He had effectively created a smaller, more claustrophobic cellar for himself to navigate. The incident had broken his moment of hesitation. The only thing that mattered now was getting to her. He abandoned the shotgun outside. It was too cumbersome for the narrow, unstable shaft, and squeezed through the newly created opening. He was now armed only with a thick hunting knife and his terrifying, fanatical will. Martha heard the renewed scraping and movement. She knew he was coming, and she knew the shotgun was no longer a factor. The contraction was reaching its peak, a blinding, agonizing wave of pain. She had to move, or she would be found giving birth in the dark. With a superhuman effort, she began to crawl deeper into the mine, driven by the primal, dark imperative to protect her unborn child from its mad father. She was blindly following the main shaft, a desperate plunge into the unknown. The air grew thinner, the temperature dropped further, and the faint, creepy sound of dripping water was her only auditory guide. The deeper she went, the more the surrounding walls seemed to press in, forcing her to confront the macabre reality of the place, a tomb for the living. But in this tomb, Martha stumbled upon something unexpected, something that would turn the tide of the entire cold case pursuit. Deep inside the mine, the main shaft opened slightly into a small, dome-shaped cavity, a miner's last refuge, perhaps. And there, leaning against the damp wall, was a rusted pickaxe, discarded decades ago but still solid. It was a crude, heavy, forbidden weapon, a tool of earth-breaking now destined for human conflict. Martha reached for it, the cold steel a sudden, shocking weight in her hand. It was an equalizer, a desperate defense. As she gripped the handle, her eyes, adapting to the gloom, noticed a faint, shimmering light coming from a crevice near the roof of the cavity. It was not a ghost light or an illusion. It was a small air vent, an exhaust shaft that led to the outside, an emergency exit left by the long-vanished miners. A second, utterly miraculous escape route. But the opening was too small, the climb too dangerous, especially in her condition. It offered a psychological comfort, though, a way out if she could just hold off Elias for a few precious minutes. The sound of Elias' breathing, closer now, echoing in the narrow shaft, ripped her attention away from the escape route. He was less than 20 feet away. Martha raised the pickaxe, placing her back against the wall, positioning herself in the absolute darkness. Her imprisonment had ended in a confrontation, a horrifying showdown in the creepy, subterranean depths of the Appalachian earth, a place of dark secrets and ancient curses. Elias emerged from the narrow passage into the small cavity, his eyes struggling to adjust from the faint light of the entrance tunnel to the profound darkness of the dome. He paused, his disturbing instincts telling him something was wrong. The air was different here, thicker, and the sound of Martha's breathing was deliberately obscured. "Martha," he hissed, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Don't be a fool. This is your forbidden grave. You belong with me under the earth, safe from the curse." He took 2 steps forward, peering into the shadows, and that was his second fatal error. Martha attacked not with skill but with the desperate primal strength of a woman fighting for her life and the life of her child. The pickaxe swung out of the darkness, a heavy, clumsy blow aimed at his midsection. It connected with a dull, sickening thud. Elias cried out, a sharp, macabre sound of pain and surprise, and stumbled backward, dropping his hunting knife. Martha did not hesitate. The surge of adrenaline, fueled by weeks of imprisonment and terror, was driving her. She swung again, this time aiming for his legs. He managed to deflect the blow with his arm, the steel scraping a painful gash, but the force of the strike threw him off balance. He fell, half pinned against the narrow entrance, effectively blocking his own path of retreat. The hunter had become the hunted, trapped in the very earth he believed gave him dominion. The close-quarters struggle in the utter darkness was horrifying and brief, a macabre dance of survival. Elias, though wounded and temporarily trapped, was still a large, powerful man, his hands grappling for Martha, his intent to subdue her, not kill her. He still needed his curse contained, not ended. He lunged, trying to wrest the pickaxe from her grasp. Martha held on with desperate tenacity, the sharp, agonizing pain of her contractions momentarily forgotten. As they wrestled, their movements dislodged the rotten timbers of the cavity's roof. A single, ominous creak echoed through the mine. Both of them froze, suddenly aware of the dark, unstable reality of their environment. Elias, his fanaticism instantly replaced by self-preservation, tried to push himself free. But Martha, understanding the sudden, disturbing leverage the unstable mine gave her, used the moment to her advantage. She jammed the end of the pickaxe handle against his chest and shoved, pushing him harder against the fragile timber supports of the entrance tunnel. It was the final, devastating act of her cold case escape. The support beams groaned, splintered, and gave way entirely, sending a torrent of rock and dirt, a man-made landslide, cascading down, burying the narrow entrance and Elias Thorne along with it. The silence that followed the rockfall was absolute, broken only by the sound of falling debris settling and Martha's ragged, shuddering breaths. The small dome cavity was now entirely sealed, its forbidden entrance swallowed by the earth. She was alone. Elias was gone, buried under the weight of his own dark madness. Martha collapsed onto the damp ground, the pickaxe clattering against the stone, the sheer shock and exhaustion overwhelming her. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a body racked with pain and the terrifying immediate awareness that her labor was now fully advanced. The delivery was imminent. She had escaped her husband's cellar only to give birth in the cold, creepy embrace of a mountain tomb. But she was free, and that small, macabre victory gave her the final focus she needed. She crawled to the small emergency air vent she had noticed earlier. It was her only connection to the outside world, a thin thread of life. She used her remaining strength to clear the debris around it, ensuring a steady stream of fresh, cold air. The darkness was total, but the fear of Elias had vanished, replaced by the primal need of a mother. History would record her escape as an act of singular bravery, but the immediate aftermath was the ultimate test of human endurance and the horrifying consequences of her imprisonment. The hours that followed were a blur of agonizing pain and desperate solitary effort. In the pitch-black darkness, guided only by instinct and the cold stone walls, Martha Thorne delivered her baby, a son. The sound of his first, weak cry echoed in the small cavity, a small, beautiful noise that instantly pushed the macabre memory of the struggle and the earth-shaking collapse into the background. She was a mother, alone in a tomb, with a newborn child surrounded by the sealed secrets and vanished souls of the mountain. She used the remains of her torn shift to clean and swaddle him. The cold was a constant enemy, the lack of food a persistent, disturbing reality. But the child was her lifeline, her focus. He was the living, breathing, immediate proof of her escape, the final, forbidden fruit of her terrifying imprisonment. She had no way of knowing what time of day it was, only that the air coming through the vent was cold and constant. She settled into a state of watchful waiting, conserving her strength, trying to keep the baby warm with her own body heat. She was in an isolated, underground cold case of her own making, hopping desperately that the outside world, specifically Jedediah, would realize she had never truly vanished. Jedediah, the neighboring farmer, had not forgotten his unease about the Thorne cabin. The unannounced trip, Martha supposedly took didn't sit right with him, and the sight of that heavy padlock on the cellar door lingered in his mind like a creepy melody. The morning after the collapse, he decided to take a circuitous route past the Thorne property, ostensibly to check his distant boundary markers. What he found confirmed his darkest suspicions. The cabin was open, but eerily silent. A breakfast half-eaten, the cellar door unbolted and wide open, leading to an obvious, horrifying emptiness. The shotgun was leaning against the fireplace, untouched. But the most disturbing discovery was outside the foundation vent, the small patch of freshly disturbed earth, the signs of a struggle or a desperate exit. Jedediah, a man who believed implicitly in the macabre power of Appalachian curses and forbidden secrets, knew instantly that this was no simple missing person case. He followed the signs Elias had missed, the faint scuff marks leading toward the creek, and then the telltale broken undergrowth indicating a pursuit. He was a simple man, but his common sense cut through the mystery. Elias was hunting his wife. The truth of her imprisonment was an unspoken, immediate realization. This was no time for the distant sheriff. This was a matter for the community. Jedediah turned and ran back toward his own farm, his mind racing to raise an alarm that would pierce the mountain silence. The small mountain community, insular and initially reluctant to interfere in a domestic dispute, was galvanized by Jedediah's disturbing news. The combination of Martha's sudden vanished status, the creepy behavior of Elias, and the clear evidence of a forced exit from the cabin was enough to ignite their inherent suspicion of the outsider. A small search party of 5 men, led by Jedediah, was quickly organized, armed with rifles, lanterns, and a grim determination to find the truth, no matter how dark or macabre. They followed the trail Jedediah had already established, the route of the hunter, not the hunted. The trail eventually led them to the abrupt, upward ascent toward the old miner's hole. The location was forbidden, a place of superstition and bad luck, but the desperation of the situation overcame their fear. As they approached the ridge, they noticed the profound, unnatural silence. And then they saw the debris field, the unmistakable sign of a localized rockfall centered on the narrow opening of the old mine shaft. Jedediah, a knot of horrifying certainty forming in his stomach, knelt at the pile of fresh rock and timber. He could see the faint imprint of a heavy boot, Elias' boot, in the dirt right at the edge of the collapse. The pieces of the cold case suddenly slammed together. An escape, a pursuit, and an agonizing confrontation that ended in a man's subterranean burial. The men shouted Martha's name into the debris, their voices echoing in the thin, cold air. Only silence answered. They began the slow, cautious work of clearing the rocks, but the task was monumental, and the threat of further collapse was immediate and disturbing. They worked for hours, the macabre image of what might lie beneath the earth driving their effort. It was slow-burn suspense in its most physical form. As the sun began to set, casting dark shadows over the ridge, one of the younger men, an experienced climber, noticed the faint vertical scar on the rock face above the main collapse, the ventilation shaft. He climbed carefully, confirming it was indeed an exhaust vent. He knelt, put his mouth to the opening, and yelled into the hole. "Martha, if you're down there, make a sound." The men waited, their lanterns casting an anxious glow on the debris. And then a sound, faint, weak, but undeniably human, drifted up from the shaft. A small, almost inaudible cry, followed by the sound of a woman weeping in exhaustion and relief. Martha and her child were alive. The search party erupted in a cheer that was quickly muffled by Jedediah's urgent command for silence and caution. The imprisonment had ended, but the rescue was just beginning, and the logistical challenges of getting a weakened woman and a newborn baby out of a forbidden, unstable mine shaft were immense. The curse had been broken, but the final, horrifying danger remained. The rescue was a testament to the quiet, hard-won resilience of the mountain people. They worked through the night, not clearing the main, dangerous entrance but focusing on the small ventilation shaft. Ropes were secured, a small wooden harness was fashioned, and a young, thin man was lowered down into the dark hole. The exchange that followed was one of profound, emotional intensity, a moment where the macabre history of the mountain gave way to the simple miracle of survival. Martha, weak but lucid, entrusted her newborn son to the miner's care first. He was hauled up, crying but healthy, into the waiting arms of the community. A wave of relieved, disturbing silence swept over the scene, the sound of a life saved from a forbidden grave. Then the extraction of Martha. It was an agonizing climb, slow and deliberate, the rope chafing, her body protesting every inch of the vertical ascent. But the men above pulled with a strength born of moral duty, not simple muscle. When Martha Thorne finally emerged from the hole, blinking in the cold, dark morning light, she was a specter, mud-caked, thin, and utterly exhausted, but unequivocally alive and free from her subterranean imprisonment. The search party had a survivor, and more importantly, a horrifying story that would forever alter the local cold case folklore. Martha was immediately taken back to Jedediah's farm, where his wife, a kind, sturdy woman, began the slow process of nursing her back to health. The child, named Adam, thrived despite his macabre subterranean birth. But the story did not end with their escape. The community, though relieved, was left with the inescapable, disturbing reality of Elias Thorne, buried alive under the ridge. This was not a vanished man. This was a man whose location was known, a man who had committed a forbidden act of imprisonment. The local sheriff, a stoic but methodical man named Harlan, was eventually summoned. He arrived 2 days later, bringing with him a small crew of miners from the nearest settlement. The decision was made to stabilize the mine entrance and exhume the body. The work was difficult, dangerous, and steeped in a profound, creepy sense of dread. The Appalachian Mountains, it seemed, were reclaiming the man who had tried to impose his dark will upon the earth. The exhumation would be the final, chilling chapter of this cold case, providing the physical evidence necessary to validate Martha's unbelievable, horrifying ordeal. When the miners finally breached the main collapse, the scene that greeted them was precisely as Martha had described, a tableau of macabre finality. Elias Thorne was found trapped and crushed beneath the weight of the rock and earth, the broken timbers of the mine shaft surrounding him. His body was recovered, and the cause of death was ruled as accidental, a tragic consequence of the mine collapse, a neat clinical end to a deeply disturbing sequence of events. However, Sheriff Harlan, an old-school investigator who trusted his instinct more than initial appearances, noted a detail that gave him pause. The small hunting knife was found clutched in Elias' hand, not dropped near the entrance as would be expected, but seemingly drawn and ready for a close-quarters struggle. More importantly, the broken end of the heavy pickaxe handle, the forbidden weapon Martha had used, was found driven deep into the debris near Elias' chest, a silent testament to the struggle. The official record would state accidental death, but the true, dark history of that mine shaft would forever whisper the tale of a woman fighting her way out of a fate worse than death, and the self-inflicted curse that consumed her captor. The imprisonment was avenged by the mountain itself. Martha Thorne, though physically recovered, carried the dark, psychological scars of her imprisonment. She was a living cold case, a survivor whose story was so horrifying and so steeped in the macabre of Appalachian folklore that many outside the immediate community simply refused to believe it. Whispers followed her, whispers of madness, of a creepy bad seed in Elias' family, or even the persistent, disturbing idea that she had somehow invited the curse upon herself. But the men who found her, the men who pulled her and her baby from that forbidden mine shaft, they knew the truth. They rallied around her, providing the resources and the quiet support necessary for her to sell the lonely, cursed cabin and move away from the hollow. She took her son, Adam, and left the mountains, disappearing into the wider American landscape. Her name vanished from the local records, a conscious effort to leave the terrifying history behind her. Her escape was not merely a physical act. It was a psychological break from the dark forces of isolation and fanaticism that had nearly consumed her. The Thorn Cabin, once a symbol of Elia's terrifying control, became a physical monument to the macabre events of 1883. No one would buy it. Locals avoided the hollow entirely, believing the place was steeped in a dark and profound curse. Over the years, the cabin began the slow, inevitable process of decay. The roof sagged, the porch rotted, and the windows shattered, allowing the elements to reclaim the space. But the cellar, Martha's cellar, remained. The heavy timber walls built by Elias for the purpose of imprisonment were stubbornly resilient. Visitors, usually young men on a reckless dare or writers searching for forbidden inspiration, would occasionally brave the journey to the hollow. They would always report the same disturbing sensation: an unnatural coldness, a profound silence, and the creepy feeling of being watched from beneath the earth. The cellar became known in local lore as the Hollow Man's Cage, a physical, tangible link to a cold case that was solved, but never truly understood. The house fell, but the cage remained, a permanent reminder of the horrifying act committed there. Decades passed. The story of Martha Thorne and the man who imprisoned his pregnant wife in the cellar morphed from a terrifying historical event into a piece of local, macabre folklore. Details were exaggerated, elements of the supernatural were woven in, and the true, disturbing horror of Elias Thorne's fanatical cruelty was sometimes obscured by the sensationalism of the retelling. But the core truth remained. A woman, alone and pregnant, used her wits and desperate courage to escape a certain, forbidden death at the hands of her husband, a man driven mad by an Appalachian curse. The tale serves as a potent, dark allegory about the isolation of the mountains, the dangers of unchecked superstition, and the fierce, unyielding will of human survival. It is a story that refuses to vanish, passed down through hushed whispers around campfires and in the creepy silence of isolated mountain homes. It is a reminder that the greatest horrors are often not spectral, but human, built with wood and nails, right beneath the floorboards of home. The final, chilling coda to this cold case occurred in the 1960s, when a geological survey was being conducted near the ridge of the old miner's hole. Using modern equipment, they detected a large, disturbing void beneath the ground, near the area of the collapse. Curiosity piqued. A small, controlled excavation was undertaken. They did not find more tunnels or veins of ore. Instead, they found a small cavity, sealed off by decades of rockfall, and within it, the heavy, macabre pickaxe Martha Thorne had used to fight for her life. More horrifyingly, they found a scattering of aged bones, remnants of the men who had worked the mine, proof that the curse was real but not supernatural. The final forbidden discovery, however, was in the debris leading to the main collapse: fragments of rotted cloth and a heavy, rusted hunting knife. They were the last, physical remnants of Elias Thorne, a final, unspoken confirmation of Martha's story. The mountain, in its indifferent, powerful way, had kept its own counsel for nearly a century, guarding the secret of the man who had tried to build a dark cage for his family. The earth had reclaimed him, swallowing the abuser and preserving the evidence of the heroic escape. Martha Thorne was never heard from again, having successfully vanished into the American interior, taking her son and her dark secret with her. Her survival story, though, remains a powerful, creepy beacon of defiance against tyranny. She escaped 2 imprisonments: the small, literal cellar her husband built, and the much larger, psychological cellar of isolation and abuse he tried to force her into. Her journey from terrified captive to fierce survivor, culminating in a macabre, subterranean confrontation, is a testament to the primal strength of the will to live. The curse of the Thorne family was not one of spirits or changelings, but of human fanaticism. The forbidden nature of the story, a pregnant woman fighting a husband to the death, is what gives it its enduring, disturbing power. It challenges the conventional notions of domestic life and reveals the horrifying darkness that can bloom in the most remote corners of the world. The mountain holds many secrets, but few are as profound and as cold case certain as the story of the Appalachian man who buried his wife alive, only to be buried himself. And so we leave the hollow, now silent, overgrown, and still permeated by a palpable sense of dark, lingering dread. The remnants of the Thorn cabin are now just a pile of stones and rot, but the earth beneath it remembers. It remembers the sound of a woman screaming, muffled and trapped. It remembers the deliberate, chilling rhythm of a man's boots above. And it remembers the cold, desperate finality of a woman crawling to freedom. The story of Martha Thorne is a powerful whisper in the vast, silent cathedral of the Appalachian Mountains. It is a reminder that some macabre histories are not just found in old books or crumbling records, but are etched into the very soil, a creepy testament to human darkness and the relentless, forbidden fight for survival. Go to that hollow today, and you will not find ghosts of the long-vanished miners, but the lingering, disturbing shadow of Elias Thorne, entombed forever beneath the earth he believed would keep his curse contained. The cellar is empty, but the cage is not. It holds a profound and chilling silence, the silence of a life bought with desperation and sealed by a final,